There are nights when the world does not change your life with noise, but with a single notice that quietly removes your place in it. The wind outside Boston carried a sharp winter edge as Hannah Miller stood in the middle of her small apartment, holding a folded eviction notice that had arrived earlier that afternoon, its words simple but irreversible, stating she had until midnight on Christmas Eve to leave the only home she could still afford. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a small grocery store, and the silence in the apartment around her felt heavier than any sound she could imagine. The space was modest, a single bedroom with worn carpet, a kitchen that barely fit 2 people, and a living room that held more memories of exhaustion than comfort, yet it was still hers in a way that made the thought of losing it difficult to fully accept. She stood near the window, watching the faint glow of holiday lights outside in other buildings, knowing that inside those rooms people were preparing for warmth, gatherings, and time spent together, while inside her own space there was only a countdown that no one else was paying attention to. The landlord had already made everything clear earlier that week, his tone practical, detached, as if removing someone from a life they had built could be reduced to scheduling and procedure. Hannah had tried to respond calmly, had tried to ask for more time, but time itself was already no longer on her side. Now the paper in her hand felt like the final version of every conversation she had failed to change. Across the city, in a part of Boston that did not belong to the same kind of ordinary struggle, Vincent Moretti was not thinking about her directly, but he was already aware of a disruption forming in the city's quieter layers, the kind of disruption that did not come from noise but from imbalance. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man whose influence moved through financial and structural channels rather than visible confrontation, and even on a night like Christmas Eve, his attention remained tuned to patterns that most people would never notice. He did not yet know her name, but he knew the shape of the situation she was in. A person isolated, a deadline approaching, a system completing its removal of someone without resistance. Back inside the apartment, Hannah placed the notice on the small kitchen counter, pressing it down as if that might make it feel less final, then slowly sat on the edge of her couch, her hands resting in her lap as she tried to understand what came next when there was no longer a next step clearly defined. The holiday season outside continued without interruption, distant music playing somewhere in the building, faint laughter passing through hallways, but none of it reached her in a way that felt shared. Everything sounded separated, divided by walls she could no longer emotionally cross. She looked at the small tree in the corner of her living room, decorated modestly with a few ornaments she had collected over the years, and for a moment I did not realize that a countdown could feel heavier than time itself until the second stage of that night unfolded inside Hannah Miller's small apartment in Boston, where every sound from the hallway now seemed louder than it should have been, as if the building itself had begun to notice what was about to happen to her. She remained seated on the edge of her couch, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the eviction notice still placed on the kitchen counter like a silent confirmation that no amount of staring could change its meaning. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store, and the reality of losing her home on Christmas Eve had shifted from something she could mentally postpone into something that was now physically present in every corner of the room. The small apartment felt different than it had earlier in the day, not because anything had changed in its structure, but because she now saw every detail through the awareness of departure. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the uneven warmth near the window, the soft glow of the small Christmas lights she had hung herself, all of it now felt like a temporary arrangement rather than a lived space. Across the city, Vincent Moretti continued to receive information in fragments, not from emotional interest, but from the structural awareness that certain situations carried predictable trajectories once they reached a critical point. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man who did not engage with events through sentiment, but through recognition of imbalance, and what he was now observing was a case that had moved beyond routine financial pressure into something more visually distinct, a complete lack of remaining options within a fixed time frame. He did not yet act, but he did not ignore it either. Inside the apartment, Hannah stood up slowly and walked toward the small kitchen, not because she had a plan, but because staying still had begun to feel heavier than movement. She placed both hands on the counter and looked again at the paper, as if repetition might reveal a different outcome, but the words remained unchanged, indifferent to her presence. Outside her window, the city continued its Christmas Eve rhythm, lights reflecting off wet pavement, distant conversations rising and fading, people moving in pairs or groups that suggested continuity she no longer felt part of. She thought briefly about calling someone, then stopped before reaching for her phone, because the list of people who might answer felt shorter than the effort it would take to explain. In another part of Boston, Vincent reviewed the situation once more, not as a personal involvement, but as a structural observation that had now reached a level of clarity where intervention was no longer theoretical. He noted the timing, the location, the lack of external support systems, and the approaching deadline that compressed the entire situation into a single irreversible moment. Back in the apartment, Hannah returned to the living room and sat down again, this time facing the small decorated tree in the corner, its lights blinking at a steady rhythm that no longer felt celebratory, only present. She did not cry, not yet, but the absence of reaction felt more like exhaustion than calm. The idea of Christmas Eve, once associated with warmth and expectation, now felt like a marker that simply measured how quickly something could be lost, without anyone noticing in real time. And as the night continued to move forward without slowing for her, the distance between what she had and what she was about to lose became less abstract, and more like a quiet certainty waiting for the final moment to arrive. I did not realize how quickly a situation could narrow itself into something that felt less like a series of choices and more like a closing corridor of time. But by the third stage of that night, Hannah Miller was beginning to understand that Christmas Eve was no longer a date on a calendar but a fixed boundary she was slowly being pushed toward without any possibility of negotiation. She stood in her small Boston apartment again, moving between rooms with a kind of quiet restlessness that had no destination, her attention repeatedly returning to the same fact that the eviction notice on the kitchen counter had not changed. Even though she had looked at it so many times it almost felt like it should have softened by repetition. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store, and what had once been a simple financial struggle had now become a structured timeline that reduced her entire living space into something temporary. The building outside her window remained active with the usual sounds of holiday movement, distant footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices behind closed doors, the occasional sound of a car passing through wet streets, yet none of it reached her in a way that felt connected anymore. Everything felt separated by a layer of time that no longer included her. Earlier that evening, a brief conversation with the landlord had returned in her mind repeatedly, not because it had been dramatic, but because it had been final in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. The tone had been procedural, almost indifferent, as if her presence in the apartment was simply a condition that had expired rather than a life that had been disrupted. Now she found herself checking the time more often than she intended, not because she expected anything to change, but because the act of checking had become a way to confirm that nothing had yet arrived to resolve the situation. Across the city, Vincent Moretti continued to observe the structure of the situation with increasing clarity, not through emotional engagement, but through the recognition of a pattern that had now fully formed in his assessment. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man accustomed to identifying instability in systems before they reached visible collapse, and what he saw here was not chaos, but precision in its inevitability. A person with no remaining buffer, no external support strong enough to alter the outcome, and a deadline that functioned more like a compression point than a warning. He did not intervene yet, but the information no longer remained neutral in his attention. It had begun to occupy a space that required future resolution. Back inside the apartment, Hannah attempted to organize small tasks, not because they were necessary, but because movement prevented her from remaining in one place long enough for the silence to fully settle. She folded a blanket that was already folded, adjusted objects on the counter that did not need adjusting, and briefly opened a drawer before closing it again without taking anything out. Each action felt disconnected from purpose, yet grounded enough to prevent complete stillness. The Christmas tree in the corner remained lit, its small lights blinking in a steady rhythm that now felt less like decoration and more like a reminder that time was still progressing regardless of her circumstances. She looked at it for a long moment, not thinking about celebration anymore, but about how easily something meant to represent warmth could exist inside a situation that felt entirely different from its intention. In another part of Boston, Vincent reviewed the final structural details of the situation once more, not because anything about it was uncertain, but because certainty itself had become the reason attention was now required. The evening continued its slow approach toward midnight, and within that progression, Both the isolation of Hannah's environment and the increasing clarity of Vincent's awareness moved toward the same unseen point, one through experience and the other through recognition. And as the third stage of the night settled into place, the distance between what was happening and what had already been decided became smaller, until the only thing remaining was the quiet approach of a moment that had not yet arrived but no longer felt avoidable. I did not realize how silence inside a room could begin to feel like a countdown you could almost hear. But by the time Hannah Miller entered the fourth stage of that Christmas Eve night, the apartment no longer felt like a place she was living in and had instead become a space she was preparing to leave even while still standing inside it. She moved slowly from the living room into the small kitchen again, not because she needed anything, but because staying in one place made the reality of the eviction notice feel heavier with every passing second. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store. And what had begun earlier that day as a single document on a counter had now expanded into something that defined the entire structure of her awareness. The Christmas tree in the corner still blinked softly, its lights continuing their steady rhythm as if nothing had changed, but to her it now felt like it belonged to a different version of her life, one that was already in the process of being closed. She opened the refrigerator, stared inside without taking anything, then closed it again, the sound too loud in the quiet apartment, as if even simple actions were being amplified by the absence of anything else happening around her. Across the city, Vincent Moretti remained in a controlled state of observation, his attention no longer divided between multiple considerations, because the situation he had identified earlier had now narrowed into a single clear trajectory. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man accustomed to reading systems rather than emotions, yet what he saw here was no longer abstract. It was a person with a defined endpoint and no visible intervention within her immediate environment. The structure of it was what held his attention, the way all external supports had already collapsed without dramatic interruption, leaving only timing as the remaining variable. Back inside the apartment, Hannah sat at the edge of her bed for a moment, looking down at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, then slowly stood again and walked to the window. Outside, Christmas Eve in Boston continued without pause, lights glowing in other buildings, faint movement visible through windows across the street, and a distant sense of life continuing in parallel layers that did not intersect with her current reality. She pressed her palm lightly against the glass, not to feel anything specific, but because contact with something solid felt more real than standing in the center of the room without movement. The eviction notice remained on the counter behind her, unchanged, a fixed point that no amount of time had altered since it arrived earlier in the day. In another part of the city, Vincent reviewed the situation again with the same quiet precision, not adding new information, but refining the understanding of what was already known. The timing was fixed, the location was confirmed, and the absence of alternative housing or support had reduced the situation to a simple progression toward midnight. He did not interpret it emotionally but structurally as a system approaching completion without resistance. Inside the apartment, Hannah finally turned away from the window and looked once more at the small tree in the corner, its lights continuing their soft blinking pattern, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to sit down fully on the couch instead of pacing or moving. The silence in the room did not change, but her relationship to it had shifted slightly, as if she was no longer waiting for something to interrupt it. And as the fourth stage of the night settled into place, both within the apartment and across the city, the sense of inevitability continued to grow not through action, but through the steady removal of anything that could still delay what was already approaching. I did not realize how a single hour could begin to feel like a narrowing tunnel of time, but by the time Hannah Miller entered the fifth stage of that Christmas Eve night, the apartment no longer felt like a place she occupied and instead felt like a space she was gradually being pushed out of even before she physically left it. She remained seated on the couch for a long stretch of silence, her posture unchanged, her hands resting loosely in her lap, while the eviction notice on the kitchen counter seemed to define every angle of the room simply by existing there. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store, and what had begun earlier in the day as a single administrative warning had now fully expanded into a psychological presence that shaped how she experienced every sound, every shadow, and every second of passing time. The Christmas tree in the corner continued to blink its soft lights, but the rhythm that once felt warm now felt detached, as if it belonged to a version of the evening that no longer included her emotional participation. She stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen again, not because she had a destination, but because movement was easier than remaining still under the weight of waiting for midnight to arrive. She placed both hands lightly on the counter, staring at the eviction notice once more, reading the same lines again without absorbing anything new, as if repetition might eventually create a different outcome through persistence alone. Across the city, Vincent Moretti maintained his focus on the situation with increasing precision, not through emotional engagement, but through structural awareness of how all elements had now aligned into a single irreversible trajectory. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man accustomed to interpreting systems through pressure points and timing, and what he was observing now was a situation that had reached complete exposure, where no additional variables remained to alter the outcome before the final deadline. Inside the apartment, Hannah finally exhaled slowly and leaned back slightly from the counter, her eyes drifting toward the small living room where the couch sat in the center of a space that now felt smaller than it had earlier in the evening, not physically, but perceptually, as if the boundaries of the room had shifted inward over time. She walked back and sat down again, this time more slowly, as if the act of sitting required more intention than before. Outside her window, Boston continued its Christmas Eve rhythm, faint light reflections moving across wet pavement, distant footsteps echoing through hallways, life continuing in parallel layers that no longer intersected with her immediate reality. In another part of the city, Vincent reviewed the final structure of the situation again, confirming what had already become clear. The absence of support systems, the fixed deadline, and the lack of any visible intervention had created a condition where the outcome was no longer uncertain, only pending arrival. Back inside the apartment, Hannah turned her gaze once more toward the Christmas tree, its lights blinking steadily in the corner, and for the first time that night, she did not try to interpret what it meant. She simply looked at it, allowing it to exist without attaching expectation or meaning. The silence in the room remained unchanged, but her reaction to it had softened into something quieter, something that no longer resisted its presence. And as the fifth stage of the night settled fully into place, both within the apartment and across the city, the sense of approaching completion continued to strengthen not through action or interruption, but through the steady disappearance of anything that could still delay what was already inevitably moving toward its final moment. I did not realize how a final hour could feel less like waiting and more like the quiet closing of a door that had already begun to move long before anyone noticed, but by the time Hannah Miller entered the sixth stage of that Christmas Eve night, the apartment in Boston no longer felt like a place she was living inside and instead felt like a space that had already accepted her departure as something inevitable rather than immediate. She remained seated on the couch for a long stretch of silence, her body still, her gaze lowered toward the floor, while the eviction notice on the kitchen counter no longer felt like an object that carried new meaning, but instead like a fixed point that had already completed its function earlier in the evening. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store, and what had started as a single notice had now fully expanded into a condition of time itself, where every minute seemed to confirm the same outcome without needing further explanation. The Christmas tree in the corner continued to blink its small lights, but even that soft rhythm no longer carried emotional contrast. It simply existed as part of a room that was no longer emotionally responsive to her presence in the same way it had been at the beginning of the night. She stood up slowly, walking to the window again, not because she expected anything outside to change, but because movement had become a way to remain connected to the passing of time rather than being absorbed by it. Outside, Boston continued its Christmas Eve motion, faint reflections on wet streets, distant headlights passing through intersections, people moving through their own uninterrupted timelines that did not pause for the stillness inside her apartment. In another part of the city, Vincent Moretti maintained his attention on the situation with complete structural clarity, no longer analyzing possibility, but confirming completion of trajectory. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man who understood timing not as emotion but as alignment, and what he now saw was a system that had reached its final compression point, where no additional external input could alter the outcome before midnight. Back inside the apartment, Hannah finally turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the center of the room, her steps unhurried, as if speed itself no longer carried relevance. She paused near the couch, looking at the small decorated tree one last time, its lights continuing their steady blinking pattern, and for a brief moment she did not assign meaning to it, did not interpret it as comfort or loss, but simply acknowledged it as part of the space she was in. Then she sat down again, not collapsing, not reacting, but simply settling into stillness as if the act of waiting itself had ended. The silence in the room remained unchanged, but its function had shifted completely. It no longer felt like anticipation or pressure, only presence without expectation. Across the city, Vincent confirmed internally what had already become clear through observation alone. The situation had fully resolved into its final structure, and nothing remained except the passage of the remaining minutes toward an already defined outcome. Back inside the apartment, Hannah did not look at the eviction notice again. She did not need to. It had already completed its purpose in her understanding of the night. And as the sixth stage of Christmas Eve settled into its final form, both within the apartment and across the city, everything that had once been uncertain now existed only as a quiet, completed reality that no longer required anything further to happen in order to be understood. I did not realize how silence could become heavier when it is no longer filled with expectation, but by the time Hannah Miller entered the seventh stage of that Christmas Eve night, the apartment in Boston had fully transitioned into a space that no longer reacted to her presence, as if everything within it had already accepted the outcome long before midnight arrived. She remained seated on the couch for a long moment, her posture still, her hands resting loosely in her lap, while the eviction notice on the kitchen counter no longer felt like a warning or even a reminder, but instead like an object that had already completed its purpose earlier in the evening and no longer required attention. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store, and what had begun as a single administrative action had now fully expanded into a temporal boundary that shaped how every second in the room felt, compressing time into something slow, steady, and inevitable. The Christmas tree in the corner continued to blink softly, its small lights repeating their pattern without interruption, but even that gentle rhythm no longer created contrast against the silence. It simply existed within it, fully absorbed into a room that no longer distinguished between warmth and absence. She finally stood up again and walked toward the kitchen counter, not because she expected anything to change, but because movement had become a way to remain grounded inside the passage of time, rather than dissolving into stillness. She looked at the eviction notice one more time, not reading it again, but acknowledging its presence as something already fully integrated into her understanding of the night. Across the city, Vincent Moretti maintained his observation without interruption, no longer interpreting possibilities or outcomes, but instead confirming that the structure he had identified earlier had now reached its final phase of completion. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man who understood timing as alignment rather than emotion, and what he was witnessing had already moved beyond uncertainty into a fully defined trajectory, where only the final passage of time remained. Inside the apartment, Hannah stepped away from the counter and moved slowly back toward the center of the room, her steps measured but unhurried, as if speed no longer held any relevance in a moment that had already completed its internal progression. She paused near the couch again, looking briefly at the Christmas tree in the corner, its light still blinking in a steady rhythm that now felt less like decoration and more like continuity, and for the first time that night she did not try to assign meaning to it. She simply observed it as part of the room, neither warm nor cold, neither symbolic nor empty. She then sat down again, not collapsing into emotion, not resisting anything, but simply settling into a stillness that no longer carried tension or expectation. The silence in the apartment remained unchanged, but its function had shifted completely. It no longer suggested waiting, nor did it suggest loss, but instead existed as a completed state of presence without anticipation. Outside, Boston continued its Christmas Eve motion without interruption, headlights passing across wet streets, distant footsteps echoing through hallways, life continuing in parallel layers that no longer intersected with the stillness inside her space. In another part of the city, Vincent confirmed once more that nothing remained to be adjusted, interpreted, or influenced, because the situation had already reached its final structural form. Back inside the apartment, Hannah no longer looked at the eviction notice at all. It had already finished its role within her understanding of the night, existing now only as a memory of a process that had already concluded. And as the seventh stage of Christmas Eve settled fully into place, both within the apartment and across the city, everything that had once been uncertain now remained only as a quiet, completed reality that required no further change to be fully understood. I did not realize how a final hour could feel less like something approaching and more like something already decided, but by the time Hannah Miller entered the 8th stage of that Christmas Eve night, the apartment in Boston had fully settled into a strange stillness where even time itself seemed to move with caution. She remained seated on the couch for a long period without shifting her posture, her gaze lowered toward the floor, while the eviction notice on the kitchen counter no longer carried any emotional weight at all, existing now only as a completed instruction rather than an active threat. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store, and what had once been a night of fear and uncertainty had now transformed into something quieter, a condition where nothing inside the room demanded reaction anymore. The Christmas tree in the corner continued its soft blinking rhythm, unchanged and uninterrupted, but even its light now felt like part of a background system, rather than a source of comfort or meaning. Hannah slowly stood up again, not because she had a plan, but because stillness itself had become difficult to remain inside for too long. She walked toward the window and looked out at Boston, where Christmas Eve continued in its distant, ordinary motion, cars passing, lights reflecting, people moving through lives that felt far removed from her own. Across the city, Vincent Moretti moved for the first time in a way that shifted the structure of the evening, not with urgency but with final clarity. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man who did not operate on impulse but on alignment, and what he had been observing had now reached the point where observation naturally transitioned into presence. He did not bring attention to himself through noise or disruption. Instead, he arrived in a way that felt almost integrated into the environment of the city, as if the situation itself had drawn him toward its final point of resolution. Outside Hannah's building, footsteps approached the hallway with controlled certainty, not rushed, not hesitant, simply deliberate in their timing. Inside the apartment, Hannah did not immediately react, not because she was unaware, but because reaction itself no longer felt necessary in the same way it had earlier in the night. The silence in the room remained unchanged, but it now carried a different density, as if something external had entered its boundary without breaking it. The knock came next, not loud, not forceful, but distinct enough to separate itself from the surrounding quiet. It was not repeated immediately, and that absence of repetition made it feel more final than urgency ever could. Hannah turned her head slightly toward the door, her expression unchanged, neither fearful nor expectant, but simply aware that something had shifted outside her immediate space. The Christmas tree continued to blink in the corner as if nothing in the room had changed, yet everything in perception had subtly reoriented itself toward that single point of contact. Outside the door, Vincent remained still after knocking, his presence defined not by intrusion but by completion of arrival, as if the act itself had already fulfilled its purpose before any response occurred. Inside the apartment, Hannah did not move toward the door immediately. Instead, she remained standing in place for a moment, as if allowing the fact of the knock to settle fully into the room before deciding what it meant. The eviction notice remained on the kitchen counter, unchanged, but now entirely disconnected from the immediate moment, no longer the center of anything happening in real time. And as the 8th stage of Christmas Eve reached its quiet threshold, both inside the apartment and outside the door, the night entered a state where nothing more needed to be declared for the next moment to begin forming itself. I did not realize how a single knock could divide a night into what it was and what it would never be again, but by the time Hannah Miller entered the final stage of that Christmas Eve night, standing still in her small Boston apartment, she understood that the sound at her door was not just an interruption but a transition she could not yet define. She remained in place for a moment longer, her body unmoving, her eyes fixed toward the door while the rest of the apartment seemed to hold its breath with her. She was 24 years old, a white American woman working long shifts at a grocery store, and everything she had experienced that night had already compressed her world into a single point of waiting that no longer felt like fear but like suspended time. The Christmas tree in the corner continued to blink softly, its rhythm unchanged, but now it felt distant, as if it belonged to a version of the evening that existed before this moment had fully formed. Another knock came, still controlled, still deliberate, and this time Hannah finally moved, slowly stepping toward the door without urgency, as if her body had already accepted that whatever waited on the other side had been present long before she acknowledged it. She placed her hand on the door but did not open it immediately, and in that brief silence between contact and action, the entire apartment felt smaller, as if everything within it had been drawn toward this final boundary. Outside, Vincent Moretti stood with steady composure, a white Italian-American mafia boss whose presence did not demand attention through force but through certainty, his understanding of the situation already complete in a way that did not require emotional interpretation. He had arrived not to disrupt but to resolve, and that distinction shaped the stillness around him. When Hannah finally opened the door, there was no dramatic movement, only recognition, and Vincent did not step forward immediately, allowing the moment to exist without pressure, his gaze briefly shifting past her into the apartment as if confirming what he already understood. Inside, the eviction notice still rested on the kitchen counter, but its meaning had already been dissolved by the presence now standing at the threshold. A quiet exchange followed, not filled with many words, but enough to shift the structure of the night. Vincent asked for confirmation of the situation. Hannah answered in a voice that carried more exhaustion than explanation, and within that minimal exchange, the imbalance of the evening became fully visible. Vincent stepped inside only after a pause, not as an intrusion, but as a continuation of something already in motion, and his attention moved through the space with calm assessment, not judgment, not surprise but alignment. A single phone call was made, brief and controlled, its content not important in tone but decisive in effect, and within minutes the structure of Hannah's immediate reality began to shift in ways that were not visible through emotion but through consequence. The urgency of eviction dissolved into procedural reversal, not through confrontation, but through quiet resolution of authority that required no further explanation. Hannah stood near the doorway between the living room and kitchen, watching without fully understanding how quickly the night was changing shape, while Vincent remained still, observing not her confusion but the stabilization that followed disruption. The Christmas tree continued its steady blinking in the corner, unchanged, yet the atmosphere of the room had subtly shifted from finality to suspension, as if the night had paused just long enough to allow a different outcome to replace the one that had been approaching. Outside, Christmas Eve in Boston continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the small interior shift that had altered one life's trajectory entirely. Hannah did not speak for a long moment, and neither did Vincent because nothing required immediate explanation. What mattered had already occurred in action rather than language. And as the final stage of that night settled into place, the apartment no longer felt like a space preparing for absence, but instead like a space that had been quietly rewritten by a presence that arrived not to end something, but to change what the ending would have been.